"Sir, I need you to sit down right now." The flight attendant's voice was thin and scared, stretched tight by panic. She stood in the aisle of the Boeing 777, her arms held out as if to keep something bad away. Edward Cooper, 83 years old, did not move. He remained standing, a small, still point in the chaos of the cabin. His eyes, the color of a faded sky, were not on the flight attendant, but on the flickering emergency lights above her head. The man beside her, a federal air marshal in a wrinkled suit, stepped forward. His face showed strained authority. "You heard her, old man. Sit down. This is a federal situation." His hand drifted toward the bulge under his jacket, a gesture meant to scare people. Edward's gaze shifted, meeting the marshal's for a brief, unblinking moment. There was no fear in his eyes, only a deep, weary calm that seemed to make the younger man even more nervous. The situation had gotten bad quickly. A sharp, bitter smell of burning electronics. A sudden lurch, then a series of failures. The cabin lights flickered and died, replaced by the eerie orange glow of the emergency strips. The in-flight entertainment screens went black, but the most terrifying silence was the one from the cockpit. For 10 minutes, the flight crew had been trying to reach the captain. Their increasingly frantic knocks on the reinforced door were met with nothing. The plane was a ghost ship at 37,000 feet, and the passengers were beginning to fall apart. A woman in the row behind Edward was openly crying. A businessman was shouting into a dead cell phone. The air was thick with the metallic taste of fear. The air marshal, whose name was Agent Sullivan, seemed to believe that keeping order meant being tough with the one person who wasn't panicking. "I am not going to ask you again," Sullivan said, his voice low and threatening. He took another step, getting in Edward's personal space. "We have a possible cockpit breach or the pilots are down. The last thing I need is some confused passenger wandering the aisle." Edward's voice, when it came, was raspy but clear, cutting through the noise. "The transponder is off." Sullivan blinked. "What?" "The plane's transponder. It's not broadcasting our position," Edward repeated, his gaze distant as if he were seeing something far beyond the walls of the plane. "And we've changed our course. We're banking slightly southeast, away from our flight path to Chicago." Sullivan's face tightened. The old man was either dangerously smart or dangerously confused. He chose to believe the latter. "How could you possibly know that? Did you see that on your little movie screen before it went out? Sit down. Now." Edward ignored him. He was listening to the engines, his head tilted at a slight angle. The pitch was wrong. The right engine was running rough, a subtle vibration that he could feel in the soles of his worn leather shoes. He had spent a lifetime learning the language of machines under stress, and this one was screaming. "The flight crew needs to seal the forward galley," Edward said, his voice taking on a quiet authority that allowed no argument. "The fire is in the main electronics bay, just below the cockpit floor. It's why they're not responding. They're likely already gone." "The fumes would have been first." The flight attendant gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sullivan's face went from suspicion to open hostility. "That's it. You're done," the marshal hissed. He reached out to grab Edward's arm. "You're creating a panic. You are a threat to the safety of this flight." Edward didn't flinch. He simply looked down at the hand that was about to grip his thin arm. "Son," he said, his voice soft but weighted with ancient gravity, "you have no idea what a threat to this flight looks like, but you will very soon if you don't let me help." The cabin shuddered again, more violently this time. A collective scream went up from the passengers. The plane was sick, and the people in charge were just as lost as everyone else. Sullivan saw the rising wave of panic in the cabin and realized that grabbing an elderly man might set off a full-blown riot. He let his hand drop, but his eyes promised trouble later. He pointed a trembling finger at Edward. "You stay right there. Don't move. Don't speak," he ordered before turning his attention to the rest of the cabin, trying to project a calm he did not feel. "Everyone, please remain calm. We are handling the situation." But no one was listening to him. They were watching Edward. They were watching the old man who stood unbowed in the aisle, a pillar of calm in a world that was tilting. He seemed to know things they didn't, and in their terror they clung to that small, impossible hope. Edward knew the fire would soon damage the hydraulic lines that ran alongside the electronics bay. Once that happened, they wouldn't be a ghost ship anymore. They would be a coffin. Time was running out, and the only person standing in his way was a man who saw a problem, not a solution. Sullivan continued his act of control, barking orders at the flight attendants who moved about with desperate, unfocused energy. He saw himself as the protector, the shield against the chaos. In his mind, Edward was just another problem to be managed, another civilian who didn't understand the rules. The old man's calm was strange, an irritation. "What's with the watch?" Sullivan sneered, noticing the object on Edward's wrist for the first time. It was an old, oversized watch, its steel case scarred and pitted. The leather band was cracked with age. It looked like something out of a museum. "Your grandpa give you that? Maybe it can tell you what time we're all going to die." The jab was cruel, born of fear and frustration. Edward glanced down at the watch. Its face was a complex array of dials and hands, the crystal scratch from 1,000 impacts. He didn't see an antique. He saw the frantic, desperate glow of its hands in a smoke-filled cockpit, the only source of light as he wrestled with the controls of a damaged aircraft over enemy territory. He saw the face of his co-pilot, young and terrified, illuminated in that same faint green light for a split second before the world outside exploded in a flash of white. The watch was a reminder of a day he had survived when he shouldn't have, a promise he had made to a man who didn't make it home. It was a reminder that he had faced down death before. He looked back at Sullivan, his expression unchanged. The insult hadn't landed. It had simply disappeared against the sheer, silent weight of his history. The plane dropped a few hundred feet in a pocket of turbulence, and another wave of screams washed through the cabin. The situation was now critical. The smoke was thicker, seeping from the seams around the cockpit door. The flight crew was useless, frozen by procedure and terror. Sullivan was focused on the wrong threat. Edward knew that if they couldn't talk to someone on the ground, someone who understood the language of the sky, their final moments would be measured in minutes. His eyes scanned the cabin, not in panic, but with methodical purpose. He was looking for a tool. He saw it when one of the flight attendants stumbled, her service bag spilling its contents into the aisle. Among the packets of wipes and miniature bottles was a small handheld emergency radio, the kind they used for ground communications, but with a range that was, in theory, line of sight to the ground. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. He moved. His speed was surprising for a man his age, a fluid economy of motion that spoke of long-forgotten training. He scooped up the radio before Sullivan could even react. "What do you think you're doing?" Sullivan yelled, lunging for him. But he was stopped. A young woman, a college student in a university sweatshirt, had instinctively stuck her leg out into the aisle. Sullivan tripped, sprawling clumsily. "Sorry," she said, her voice laced with anything but apology. At the same time, a young man in an army uniform, a private first class on his way home, stood up and positioned himself between Sullivan and Edward. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a silent, solid barrier. He had seen the same thing the student had, a quiet competence in the old man that the loud air marshal completely lacked. They had chosen their side. Sullivan scrambled to his feet, his face purple with rage. "You are all under arrest. You are interfering with a federal agent." But his threats were empty. Edward had already turned away, the small radio in his hand. He was fumbling with the dials, his old fingers struggling with the small knobs. The army private leaned in. "Need help with that, sir?" "The guard frequency," Edward rasped, his eyes not leaving the device. 243 megahertz. "It's a long shot." The young soldier's hands were swift and sure. He tuned the radio, the static hissing and crackling. He handed it back to Edward. "It's ready, sir." Edward lifted the radio to his lips. Sullivan was trying to push past the soldier, shouting about regulations and prison time. But no one was listening. The entire cabin was silent, watching the old man with the radio. They were all holding their breath. Edward pressed the transmit button. His first words were lost in a burst of static. He tried again, his voice now a low, powerful command that seemed to come from another man, another lifetime. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is civilian flight 739er. Any military asset on guard. Do you copy?" He paused, listening to the static. Nothing. He took a breath and tried again, this time adding the 6 words that would change everything. "Requesting immediate assistance. This is Ugly Six. I repeat, Ugly Six is on board and assuming command. The call went out into the vast, indifferent sky, a ghost calling out from a dying machine. At the Air Route Traffic Control Center in Aurora, Illinois, the world was an orderly series of green blips on dark screens. But one blip was missing. Flight 739 had vanished from their scopes 10 minutes ago. A ghost in the system. The phones were already ringing, a quiet panic building among the controllers. Then, on a speaker reserved for the emergency guard frequency, a voice cut through the static. It was weak, garbled. A junior controller barely registered it, ready to dismiss it as noise. Civilian Flight 739er, Ugly Six. On board and assuming command. The junior controller frowned. Ugly Six? What is that? Some kind of prank? Behind him, a man stood up from his desk so quickly his chair shot backward and hit the wall. He was a senior supervisor, a retired Air Force colonel named Richards, a man who had seen and heard everything. His face, normally calm, was pale. Get me a fix on that transmission, Richards roared, his voice cutting across the entire control room. Now, scramble the nearest alert fighters. Tell them it's a Nightingale event. I want 2 jets on that plane's wing 5 minutes ago. The room, which had been tense, exploded into a flurry of focused action. Controllers who had been staring helplessly at a blank space on their screen now had a purpose. A Nightingale event. Most of them didn't even know what that meant. It was a code so old, so deeply buried, it was practically a myth. Richards was already on a red phone, a direct line to NORAD. This is Aurora Center. We have a Nightingale declaration. I repeat, a Nightingale declaration from call sign Ugly Six. The silence on the other end was profound. Then a voice, a 2-star general, came on the line, sharp and clear. Confirm call sign. Ugly Six, General. Confirmed. Another pause. The general's voice was strained when he spoke again. My God, is the file active? Richards was already typing furiously at a terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard, accessing a system he hadn't touched in 20 years. A file appeared. It was almost entirely blacked out with censored marks, but 2 words were clear: Cooper, Edward, and below them, the call sign, Ugly Six. File is active, General, Richards said, his voice trembling slightly. It's him. It's Colonel Cooper. He's on that plane. The general's orders were immediate and absolute. The full weight of the United States military was now focused on a single point in the sky above the American Midwest. The legend was alive, and he needed help. Back on Flight 739, Air Marshal Sullivan had finally shoved his way past the young soldier. He lunged for Edward, his face a mask of pure fury, his authority utterly shattered, and his fear now in complete control. Give me the radio, old man, he snarled, his hand closing on Edward's shoulder. I swear to God I will put you in restraints. You are a danger to this aircraft. You're probably the cause of all this. This was his final desperate move. By labeling Edward the threat, he could reclaim some sense of control. He was ready to physically tackle the 83-year-old man, to force him into a seat and cuff him. He was a man pushed past the edge of reason, his training and judgment consumed by the escalating crisis. The other passengers shouted in protest, but Sullivan was beyond listening. He was committed to his fatal mistake, convinced he was the hero of the story. It was the last arrogant act of a man who had no idea his world was about to be turned upside down. It happened without a sound. One moment there was nothing but the gray, empty sky outside the passenger windows. The next they were there. 2 of them, sleek, angular shapes of impossible technology, appearing as if they had materialized out of the air itself. They were F-35 Lightning IIs, the most advanced fighter jets in the world. They weren't just near the plane. They were glued to its wings, their cockpits so close that the passengers could see the pilots inside, their helmeted heads perfectly still. A collective gasp went through the cabin. The raw, predatory beauty of the machines was terrifying and awe-inspiring. They slid through the air with a silent, deadly grace. The sight was so sudden, so overwhelming, that it shocked the cabin into absolute silence. The sobbing stopped. The shouting died. Every eye was fixed on the military jets hanging in the air beside them. Sullivan froze, his hand still on Edward's shoulder, his mouth agape. He, like everyone else, assumed the worst. They had been identified as a threat. They were being escorted to their doom. Then a new voice filled the cabin, crackling through the plane's own internal address system. It was clear, calm, and resonant with power. It wasn't coming from a flight attendant's handset. It was being patched in from outside. Ugly 6, this is Viper 1. We have you on our wing. Your signal is weak, but we read you. Command is on the line. What is your status, sir? The word sir hung in the air. Electric. Sullivan's hand dropped from Edward's shoulder as if it had been burned. His face, which had been flushed with rage, went bone white with shock and confusion. He looked from the fighter jet outside the window to the old man in the aisle, his mind unable to process what was happening. The voice from the F-35 pilot, Viper 1, came again, this time addressing the entire aircraft. Civilian aircraft 739er, this is Viper 1 of the United States Air Force. We are responding to a Priority 1 Nightingale distress call from Colonel Edward Cooper. Please give communication authority to him immediately. I repeat, all flight authority is now given to Colonel Cooper. The name echoed through the cabin. Colonel Edward Cooper, the quiet old man in the worn shoes. Viper 1 wasn't finished. His voice took on a tone of deep, almost mythic reverence. For the crew of 739er, the call sign Ugly 6 was retired in 1971. Its last user flew a classified aircraft over hostile territory and, after suffering catastrophic systems failure, guided his aircraft and his crew home, using nothing but a magnetic compass and the watch on his wrist. That man is on your aircraft. I suggest you listen to him. A ripple of understanding, of sheer, pure awe, spread through the passengers. They looked at Edward, truly seeing him for the first time. They saw not a frail senior citizen, but a giant, a living piece of history who had just woken from a long slumber. The young soldier who had helped him snapped to perfect, ramrod-straight attention in the middle of the aisle. The student who had tripped Sullivan stared, her hand over her mouth. Sullivan himself looked like he had been struck by lightning. He staggered back, his own authority not just challenged but utterly destroyed by a power he couldn't comprehend. Edward was no longer a passenger. He was the commander. The radio in Edward's hand crackled again. This time the voice was older, gravelly, and carried the unmistakable weight of command. It was the general from NORAD. Ugly 6, this is Sun Devil. Good to hear your voice, Colonel. It's been a while, Sun Devil, Edward replied, his own voice steady, as if he were talking to an old friend over coffee. We have an electronics fire. Cockpit is unresponsive, presumed lost. We are flying on damaged hydraulics and running low on fuel in the right engine. Understood, Ugly 6. Vipers 1 and 2 will guide you in. They'll give you the flight path to Green Valley Air National Guard Base. The runway is being prepared as we speak. Can you get to the controls? Negative, Edward said. The door is sealed, but I can talk someone through it. There's a first officer, young, terrified. He needs a calm voice. A new voice, the plane's first officer, stammered over the internal comms, patched through by the fighter jets. Sir, Colonel Cooper, I can hear you. I don't know what to do. And just like that, Edward went to work. His voice became a calm, precise instrument, cutting through the young pilot's fear. He gave instructions for dumping fuel, for managing the failing engine, for preparing the cabin for a high-speed emergency landing. He was conducting a symphony of survival. The voice of the general, Sun Devil, came back on the line one last time, his message directed squarely at the air marshal. Agent Sullivan, your service weapon has been flagged. Your credentials have been suspended pending a full review of your conduct. You will offer Colonel Cooper your full and complete cooperation. You will not speak unless spoken to. Is that understood? Sullivan could only manage a choked, pathetic nod, his entire career and sense of self collapsing in a single public rebuke. After Edward had guided the first officer through the most critical preparations for landing, he turned to the humbled, broken air marshal. There was no triumph in his eyes. No, I told you so. There was only a quiet sadness. Fear makes you deaf, son, Edward said softly, his voice barely a whisper. It's a cage you build for yourself. Courage isn't about not having the cage. It's about finding the key. He glanced down at the old watch on his wrist, its scarred face a testament to a lifetime of finding that key. He saw a flash of fire in twisted metal. He was young again, hanging upside down in the cockpit of a strange aircraft that was never supposed to exist. Smoke filled his lungs. His pilot, a man named Jesse, was gone. His navigator, Mike, was bleeding in the seat beside him. It was Mike who had given him the watch a week before. "For good luck," he'd said. As Mike's life faded, he had grabbed Edward's arm. "They called us Ugly Six because there were six of us. And the bird was ugly as sin," he'd coughed. "But you get them all home. You're Ugly Six now." Edward had flown that broken, ugly machine back across a border it had no business crossing, navigating by the stars and that watch, carrying the ghosts of his friends with him. The call sign was a burden, a promise, and an honor, a piece of his soul he thought he had buried forever. The landing was violent, a bone-jarring, screeching arrival as the crippled 777 hit the foam-covered runway at Green Valley. But the fuselage held. The landing gear held. Edward's instructions, relayed from the aisle to a terrified first officer he had never met, had been perfect. As the plane slowed to a stop, surrounded by a sea of fire trucks and emergency vehicles, a profound, breathless silence fell over the cabin. Then someone started to clap. The applause grew, swelling into a thunderous, tearful ovation. It wasn't for the pilot. It was for the old man who had refused to sit down. When the emergency slides deployed and the doors were opened, the first person to come up the steps was not a paramedic, but the four-star general from the radio. He ignored everyone else, his eyes scanning the cabin until he found Edward. He walked down the aisle, the clapping falling silent once more. He stopped in front of Edward, his back ramrod straight, and gave a salute so sharp, so precise it seemed to cut the air. "Colonel Cooper," the general said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is an honor, sir." Edward, the quiet hero, slowly, wearily returned the salute. In the weeks that followed, the story of Flight 739 became a quiet legend. The FAA and the Air Marshal Service launched a joint investigation. Agent Sullivan was reassigned to a desk job, pending his forced retirement. A new training module, unofficially called the Cooper Protocol, was developed, designed to teach federal agents and flight crews how to identify and use unexpected help during a crisis, how to look for quiet competence instead of loud authority. The airline sent Edward a formal letter of apology and offered him free flights for life. He politely declined. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Edward was sitting in a small coffee shop near his home, reading a newspaper. The bell above the door chimed, and a man walked in, hesitating just inside the doorway. It was Sullivan. He was no longer wearing a suit, just a plain polo shirt and jeans. He looked smaller, diminished. He walked over to Edward's table. "Colonel Cooper," he said, his voice quiet. Edward looked up, his expression neutral. He simply nodded. "I wanted to apologize," Sullivan stammered, twisting a napkin in his hands. "What I did, how I treated you, there's no excuse. I was scared, and you were right. I was in a cage. I'm sorry." Edward folded his newspaper and set it on the table. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, son. Let me buy you a cup of coffee." Sullivan sat, and for a long time the two men just sat there in silence as the rain washed the world clean outside. A quiet understanding passing between them, a lesson learned, a moment of grace offered and accepted.